Good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending the 2025 Daniel Patrick Moynihan Lecture. I welcome you on behalf of the American Academy of Political and Social Science and the Board of Directors. Today, we are recognizing Professor Timothy Snyder as the winner of the 2025 Moynihan Prize, awarded each year to a scholar or public servant whose work exemplifies the late Senator Moynihan's legacy. Moynihan was an accomplished social scientist, a professor, a skilled senator, and an incisive analyst of foreign affairs. Prior to serving in the Senate, he was ambassador first to India and then to the United Nations. And he was a strong defender of democracy and an opponent of authoritarian regimes. When the program starts, we're going to first hear from the Ukrainian ambassador, then Professor Angela Stent, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, will introduce Professor Snyder. Professor Snyder will speak about 30 minutes, and then he'll be in conversation with Alexa Chopivsky, Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy. They'll have a conversation. On behalf of the AAPS, I'd like to thank Sage Publications for their generous financial support for today's program. Sage publishes the Academy's flagship journal, The Annals, and is a longtime supporter of the Moynihan Prize. Second, like all organizations, there is a capital campaign for the Academy. It's mentioned in the brochure. The goal is to endow the Moynihan Prize and to broaden its reach. The Moynihan Prize has been awarded annually since 2008 and exemplifies the Academy's commitment to having public discourse and public policies informed by empirical evidence. Today's program has a QR code that provides information about the campaign. Now I'd like to introduce the ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. Olga Stefanishyna will offer some brief remarks. Prior to her becoming ambassador, she was Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration and Minister of Justice of Ukraine. She's also a member of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And when Ukraine applied for EU membership, she led the accession process. I want to thank the ambassador for agreeing to be part of today's program. So please join me in welcoming the featured participants.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to me. If I would address myself back 20 years ago, it would not be possible even to imagine that I will be here on this stage, not only making remarks, but being ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, but also sharing the stage with such a distinguished guest and people who I respect very much. So I just recall that this is the first time I met His Excellency Timothy Snyder in the United States. So we've known each other for years, but every time we had a chance to have a conversation, it was in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And that's why it's very important that whatever you will hear today, or whatever you will be reading, is something that he knows sometimes better than many Ukrainians. But in Ukraine, it's very important what has been done, because we're not only seeing that the history could be rewritten, the history could be reheard and could be presented in a lot of contexts, and now it also becomes the instrument of war. and speaking about the history of Eastern Europe and the history of my country, the history of centuries, with the voice of the American, a person who bears the unconditional authority across the whole globe, is sometimes very important for the world, but so much important for Ukraine. I cannot tell you how important it is sometimes to hear about your country from someone who's not Ukrainian, to hear somebody speaking the truth louder than sometimes, with the voice which is louder that sometimes could be the voice of a Ukrainian, especially in these times. And I'm really happy to hear sometimes when Dr. Snyder argues with Putin, questions so many things he says. Questioning is something that we do great, but we do it as politicians to politicians. We could be questions ourselves, but your job is unbelievable. I'm looking forward for our next engagement in Kyiv. It's my honor to be here today, and as just a Ukrainian first and foremost, I'm so proud that our country has you. Thank you so much, but I will not stop here. I will pass the floor to Dr. Angela Stent to introduce the word, which is more important than any words that I say right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Good afternoon to everybody. And congratulations to Timothy Snyder on winning the Moynihan Prize. It's a great honor. So Professor Snyder, as I'm sure all of you know, is one of the US's leading public intellectuals and advocates for democracy, for freedom, for human rights. And he is a prolific author. I don't think I can fully count all the books he's written, but it's at least 15, if not more. And in my brief introduction, I'm just going to highlight 3 areas where he has made major contributions to our understanding of history, of current politics, and of course of the war in Ukraine. And all of these have to do with writing about how we face the tremendous challenges we face in this country, you face in Ukraine, and in many other countries. So his first major contribution is his exploration of the very complicated history of East Central Europe. He goes back many centuries, but particularly in his book, Bloodlands, of East and Central Europe between Hitler and Stalin, which really revolutionized, I would say, our understanding of the connectivity of the violence that pervaded what he calls these bloodlands. 13 million citizens perished during that period. In a very short period of time, you had the Soviet terror, you had the Holodomor, you had the Holocaust, and of course you just had the violence of World War II. He's really reinterpreted and made it very important to understand what happened during that period of the war. Now, the second body of his work that represents a major contribution to our understanding of society are the writings that he has done on the fragility of democracy, the U.S. turn towards authoritarianism, and the role Russia has played in trying to undermine democracies both in its neighborhood and far away in the West as well. And recently, his book on freedom called for a reevaluation of the concept of freedom and really sounding the alarm for what's been happening, particularly in the United States in the past few years. And of course, his third contribution, and probably the one for which he's best known now, and it's probably why we're all gathered here, is his advocacy for Ukraine. his reinterpretation of Ukrainian history and his activism, and I will come back to that at the end, but it's really his presenting Ukrainian history to a global audience. Now, I was trained as a Sovietologist, and when I was trained, my understanding of European history was all through Russian books. And it was really when I read his work and the work of some other Ukrainian-American historians that I began to understand what the real history of Ukraine is. And I think, and of course, he has a wonderful series of lectures about Ukrainian history that are available to everyone on YouTube. And if you haven't watched them, you really should. And so you will all get a much better and fuller understanding of Ukrainian history, because I think before that, a lot of people in the West and obviously in Russia had a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of Ukrainian history than what apparently Vladimir Putin told President Trump last week when he led him through however many centuries of history. So it's very, very important to read his writings on this. Of course, we know that he has met with President Zelensky many times. I think he was just recently in Ukraine. I'm sure you'll hear about that. So he's also a great advocate for Ukraine, as well as being a distinguished scholar about Ukraine. And he's been helping raising funds to support Ukraine in this brutal war against Russia. So as a public intellectual who's had a major influence on public policy, I think he's a very worthy recipient, obviously, of the Moynihan Prize. And I invite him now to come up and speak from the podium.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much for the kind remarks to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was a young person in Washington, D.C. I had internships at various think tanks and spent some time on the Hill and did other things. And so for me, it's always a special pleasure to come back to Washington, D.C. and to speak to the very special collection of folks that one can meet here. I'm grateful for the Moynihan Prize. I'm going to take it as recognition of unpredictability, which is one of the things I associate with Senator Moynihan, and a word which for me has an entirely positive valence. So I should caution that despite the kind words at the end of Professor Stent's introduction, and despite the emphasis that Ambassador Stefanishyna placed on my current work, I was invited to give an academic lecture. So if you are not interested in hearing that, now is the time to go. You've already sat through the introductions. You can summarize them to your friends. But what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be making an academic argument. I've given 17 consecutive political appearances over the course of the last 7 days in about 5 cities. They're all online. And if you want to ask political questions afterwards, I will be happy to take them. But I want to give you actually the opportunity to do something different with me, which is to listen to an argument about the way history in fact was, or to put it in a slightly more sophisticated way, what the history of Ukraine can tell us about the legends, the stories, the tropes, the myths about the world that many of us already share. So I'm not apologizing for this. We're in a public policy school, and public policy schools do not have enough history. So another 30 minutes or so isn't going to hurt anybody. And I'm also not apologizing for it for a different reason, which is that I think when you leave the public policy school world and you go out and become a diplomat and you have to deal with what, for example, Mr. Putin thinks about history, it doesn't hurt to have a clue. It really doesn't. No, I mean, I've taught for 20 years. I've sent a lot of students out into the public policy world and into foreign affairs. And very often they come back to me and they say, the thing which mattered to me was that you taught me, Professor Snyder, about the 13th century, right? Like, that's not the only thing, but it does matter, despite what Americans think, like the world does not actually start anew every day. Okay. So what I'm going to try to do is speak about 2 or 3 or 4 examples of where the facts of Ukrainian history, often facts which have been recently understood thanks to high technology, might radically alter the way we think about the history of the whole world. And when I say high technology, I'm going to emphasize this because, as you might have noticed, the things which are called high technology are quickly destroying the future. There's this misunderstanding that high technology is useful in creating the future. I think we can more or less say that in general that's not true, unless you've been investing in NVIDIA, which perhaps is fine. But what ironically, okay, there weren't that many laughs for that, so I'm going to try it again. Like, social media hasn't actually generated the bright future, okay? It's not happening, people. Maybe this hasn't dawned yet. But what high tech actually turns out to be useful for is understanding the distant past. That's, from my point of view, from where I sit, that's actually its main, thank you for those nods in the third row. It's actually the main purpose of advanced technology. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to start with number one, which is the story of the biblical falls, which will be familiar to those of you who come from the monotheistic traditions. The idea that history began with great human error, with sins, and those sins led us to be banished to these terrible places called cities. Of course, which is always a tension, I know, in Genesis, that there were already cities and so on. But the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel is they do bad things, and then they have to go off and be in cities. And cities are corrupt, and they're terrible. And the reason why it seems this way is because the Bible is an essentially Mesopotamian text, and its notion of what cities are like comes from ancient Babylon. And that, by the way, my friends, is where our notion of cities comes from. And our notion of cities, our whole history of urbanity and civilization says that there were terrible cities, they were oppressive in Babylon, they had high walls, they tortured human beings, they sacrificed them, there were concentrations of power, religious and political. And since then, things have gotten better, because we went from cities with higher walls to cities with lower walls. We stopped sacrificing human beings at a certain point, mostly. And so on that congratulatory scale of history, we look around and we say, well, there's been this thing called progress. Things are generally getting better and so on. But those Mesopotamian cities were not the first cities, nor are cities with high walls and human sacrifice and concentrations of power the only possible model of cities. A daring thing to say in Washington, I know. Okay, I'm waiting for that to land. Thank you. There's a generous group out there. They're the ones you can see when I hold up the laugh card. The earliest cities in the world, as far as we know now, were actually in south central Ukraine, around Uman. They are older than the Babylonian cities. They are bigger in size than the Babylonian cities. And what's most interesting is that they're designed on a completely different pattern, in semicircular rows of dwellings with a big gathering space in the middle and a broad avenue. Now, we can't say exactly what this meant, but the general view among the archaeologists is that this suggests a different mode of life, a more egalitarian one, in which there were no obvious concentrations of either power or wealth. Now, if that is the way that humans initially gathered in large numbers, it suggests, first of all, that that's possible. But it also suggests that, second of all, our self-congratulatory story of progress might not be the right story. And that things just getting slightly less bad over the course of the last 6,000 years is not something to be so self-congratulatory about. Okay, second point. So that's the origins of cities, which, did I mention, are in Ukraine? Because the ambassador made a point, like, there are things that you can say as a non-Ukrainian, that you say as a Ukrainian, you get laughed off the stage. So, for example, the first human cities were on the territory of today's Ukraine. That's one of them. It happens to be true. Okay, second thing is language. Biblical fall. Babel, right? The idea that we tried to build a city up into the sky, there was a moment where suddenly all of our languages became incomprehensible. Counterpoint. Roughly half the people in the world speak an Indo-European language, and those Indo-European languages are, in fact, all related to one another. They all go back to a single root, which is Proto-Indo-European. Proto-Indo-European, we now are fairly confident on the basis of the archaeological, linguistic, but now also ancient DNA evidence, we are fairly confident that the origins of Proto-Indo-European are the steppe of South Ukraine, right? So not only the first cities, but also the language which is the base of the culture of roughly half the people who are now alive on Earth across every continent, languages that include the major Indian languages, Iranian languages, as well as Romance, Slavic, the Germanic language I'm speaking right now. All of them go back in their history to pastoral people in southern Ukraine roughly 5,000 years ago. So that is, I would dare say, a major missing point in the history of the culture of half the world. Cities plus language takes you a long way. And if the two things that I've said, the things that I've said, by the way, are uncontroversial in their fields. What's new is putting them in their territory and thinking, aha, if it weren't for this territory, then the history of the world would look different. Okay, let me give you a second example, or a third example. Second example, those are biblical false. Second example is classical myths. So, who doesn't like Amazons? And that was a rhetorical question because everybody likes Amazons, right? Everyone likes not Amazon. You're not required, but you're not required. I love it how I just spotted 9 lobbyists. All right. 10. So Amazons, right? Amazon, thank you, I got the kid to smile. All right, I won. All right. And thank you for being here. That is so amazing that you're here. So who doesn't like Amazons, right? The Greeks loved the Amazons. It was the major topic of their art, number one. And then in all of their myths, the Amazons are the major ones. Achilles fights Amazons, Heracles, Bellerophon fights Amazons, Theseus marries one. The Amazons are everywhere in their myth, but the Amazons are just a myth, right? There couldn't possibly have been, women fighting wars. That's absurd. You can't have that, not in reality, not in your stories. That can't ever have been the case. But here's the thing. We are the ones who took those Greek stories and said, oh, those have to be myths. That wasn't the Greeks. The Greeks were perfectly aware that there were Amazons because the Greeks for hundreds of years encountered Scythian female archers who they described as Amazons. The Scythians, who were the major power from roughly 700 BC to roughly 100 BC in what's now Ukraine, roughly 1/5 of their armed forces were female. And that was possible because of the state of technology of the day, which involved the domestication of the horse plus the recursive bow. As a result of those two technological developments, women were able to fight and did for hundreds of years. Now, you might be wondering, why am I so confident about this? It's because of the high technology. We have been discovering what archaeologists used to charmingly call small warriors with unusual pelvic development. In the Ukrainian steppe for well over 100 years, but thanks to ancient DNA technology, which as you're gathering doesn't always tell people what they expect, thanks to ancient DNA technology, we are now able to say that roughly 20% of the warriors buried in Scythian burial mounds were biologically female. And by the way, that figure 20% recurs over and over again with respect to women in the armed forces. It happens to be the same percentage roughly of women in Ukrainian armed forces today, fighting, by the way, the most impressive armed defense in recent history. So that's an example of a thing we think is a story, but if you know the facts on the ground from Ukraine, then you realize, aha, a story turns out to be true. Okay. So, and it points to a more fundamental reality, which is this. Greek civilization. So not for all of us, but for many of us, we live in a version of a Western civilization narrative which begins with the Greeks. You might have wondered, how could the Greeks, given that they live on a rocky island and just grow olive trees, how is it that they could have survived economically? And of course, the answer is yes, they lived on a rocky island and they grew those olive trees for export because all of their wheat came from, right, this is an excellent class. This is amazing. That's right. So the thing that we know as Greek civilization from the 5th and 4th centuries was not only economically, but deeply culturally independent with the lands of what are now southern Ukraine. And that includes the whole series of cities which Greek colonists founded on the North Black Sea coast, many of which became hybrid Scythian Greek cities or city-states. So for example, the most interesting in my view of the Greek dramas, Euripides' Iphigenia and Tauris, is set in what is in fact Crimea. It is, interestingly, the only Greek drama that we know of in which there is a female protagonist who rationally takes the stage, dominates the plot, and organizes an escape. I won't tell you the whole plot, although it's incredible, but the escape drama involving the woman who has her act together, two guys who are sort of friends who come to rescue her but are kind of bumbling, and some kind of mysterious totem that you have to rescue, became the template for all of the major stories in the West since then, right down to and including the first Star Wars movie. So all of that in some sense comes from Ukraine. And before I finish the Greeks, I have to add this. Iphigenia, if you don't know her, you may not know her story because it was popular for 2,400 years, but for the last 100 years, it's kind of fallen out of fashion. But at the beginning and the end of her story was the Greek hero Achilles. Her story is set around the time of the end of the Trojan War. Achilles, when he dies, is rescued from death and is brought to an island which the Greeks knew as White Island. And he was worshipped in White Island, which is just south of, well, let's say, Mykolaiv Oblast. He was worshipped on White Island for about 900 years by the citizens of Olbia, which is now in South Ukraine on the Black Sea. That island, White Island, where Achilles was worshipped for 900 years, is now known as Snake Island. And you may remember it as the island which the Ukrainians famously took back at the beginning of this invasion. So in a way, what I'm talking about here is it's Greece and the beginning, but it's also the entirety of our Renaissance narrative about how things work. And let me just give you an example of this from which caught my eye. There's a painting in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, in the Art History Museum in Vienna, by a Dutch painter called Otto van Veen, who was Rubens's teacher. It's from the 1620s. And it's a picture, it's in Vienna on a wall, painted by a Dutch painter in the 17th century. It has a classical subject, and the classical subject is a whole group. I sometimes forget that I'm in America and I have to be a prude. Just imagine that I've forgotten that. It's a whole group of, I'm sorry, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Okay, like bury your head in your mom's shoulder or whatever. There's a whole group of naked women. And then next to them is a pile of armor. Okay. And so you think so how do you put those, what could the naked women possibly have to do with the pile of armor? And for hundreds of years, this puzzled people, right? No, really, because what could they have? And then eventually it was figured out that this painting represents a scene from Herodotus, and is the scene of the Amazons supposedly waiting for the men who they met once a year, which, as far as ways to deal with men, I can think of worse. That's what Herodotus thought the Amazons did. And so eventually it was figured out that this was a scene of Amazons, right? And that's why there was armor, because these women were warriors. So what is this thing, right? It's a Renaissance painting. It's from the Netherlands. It's hanging in Austria. It's in these, if you're in a Eurocentric or Western civilization mode, this is all very comfortable. And then you say, oh, well, okay, we've identified this scene. It's from Herodotus. Therefore, it has to do with Greece, right? It's from Greece. Our Renaissance is going back to Greece. But you see where I'm going to go with this. The scene, the actual scene of actual female warriors, insofar as that happened, the once a year thing probably didn't happen, but the female warriors did happen, and where they happened was precisely Ukraine. So an image which seems like comfortably West European Renaissance of Greece actually has to do with the true history of what happened in Scythia, which is to say in what's now southern Ukraine. Staying in museums, let me give you a historical absence, which bothers me a lot. This has to do with the historical Goths. I told you this was going to be an academic lecture. The Goths were real people. I was talking about the Goths in my seminar the other day, and I asked my students what their association with the word Goth was, and one of them said, well, before I did the reading, Professor Snyder, I thought about the emo people. And of course, there's Gothic literature and Gothic architecture, but all of that comes, 1,700 years after the fact. So the Goths were historical people with their basis in what is now Ukraine. And the museum thing, which bothers me and where I'll start, is that there are these famous, I don't know if you've seen them or pictures of them, votive crowns, very beautiful votive crowns from the Visigoths, 7th and 8th centuries. And they hang in two museums. They hang in the Medieval Museum in Paris, Cluny, and they hang in the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. And they're relics of a Visigothic kingdom in Spain. But what no one ever says, and this is the part that troubles me, is that the Goths as a people, the people who founded this medieval kingdom in Spain, originally came from Ukraine. That knowledge has gone completely missing. Like, I feel with Ukrainian history, it's not just that no one knows Ukrainian history, it's that anything that has any contact with Ukraine somehow short circuits and is forgotten and is lost. So I'm just going to say about the word of the Goths, because they're incredibly interesting and necessary. The Goths were a people who lived in the territory of what is now Ukraine for about 300 years. And their encounter with the Huns and then with the Romans has an awful lot to do with the way that Europe actually emerges. By the way, the conversion of Ukraine to Christianity did not take place in the 10th century, as they keep trying to tell you. It took place in the 4th century. The Goths were the first people who converted to Christianity on the territory of Ukraine. Not the Rus, much as I love them, 6 centuries and more later on. And unlike the Rus, with apologies, who never actually got the Bible until 6 centuries later, by which time it was too late, and learned their Christianity on an unpredictable amalgamation of things that happened to be translated by Bulgarian priests for reasons best known to themselves. The Goths actually had most of the Bible in their own language in the 4th century. So if we're going to talk about a conversion, it would have been in the 4th century. The Goths encounter the Huns, that's putting it lightly. Some of the Goths flee across the Danube, kill a Roman emperor, sack Rome in 410, which leads to the writing of City of God by St. Augustine. It also leads to the career of Hannah Arendt, who wrote her dissertation about St. Augustine. Other Goths stayed, were dominated by the Huns, moved from Ukraine into what's now Hungary, and then pester and, along with the Huns, pester and blackmail the Roman emperor for the next 150 years or so. And by the way, the Huns were a small charismatic organization. The Goths were much more numerous. It was the merger of the Huns with the Goths and the Germanic peoples which troubled the Romans so much. But there was a merger, and that merger involved Rome too. There was a fellow called Theodoric who grew up in the Roman capital, which at the time, of course, was Constantinople, and learned Latin and Greek. And he became the last notable leader of what is of the Western Roman Empire, this fellow Theodoric. He ruled from 493 to 526. He was a Germanic person whose people were from what is now Ukraine, who ruled a Latin-speaking realm. And it was in this time that the Latin-Germanic synthesis at the heart of what is European culture was actually created. The Visigoths, who were another group of Goths, the ones who initially fled, they were the ones who ended up founding the state of Spain, which is the first and the model feudal European state, the model European kingdom with all the things we associate with European kingdoms, including the famous lays or sagas or tales. Brunhilde, who you might have heard of if you're an opera person. Brunhilde, I'm looking at you, Professor Stent. Brunhilde was a Visigothic princess. She married a Frankish king whose name was Sigibert, who is remembered as Sigurd or as Siegfried. Theodoric, who I mentioned in German stories, becomes Dietrich of Bern. Attila the Hun, you might have heard of. These are the chief characters in the early medieval German European stories about themselves. These are the basic characters of what then become the Scandinavian stories. These are the basic characters of what then become the ring cycle. And so all of this, that whole history, which is at the foundation of what Europeans or Germanic peoples think of as themselves, in its origins come from Ukraine. But there's a broader point I want to make here. If you're coming from the English-speaking world, or if you're educated in schools that have something to do with England, you probably have this notion of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, right? Okay, nod. It's reassuring when you nod. Like if some, thank you. Okay, so and that's one way of looking at it. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that the Goths fought the Romans for 150 years from the periphery and made their way to the capital and then ran the place themselves for quite a long time and then went on to found other European kingdoms. That's another way of looking at it, right? And if you're taking the history of Ukraine seriously, you can see it in that other way. Or another way to put this is that our whole story, and again, forgive my hour, I realize it's not everybody's story, but a big story about the fall of civilization might not look so correct if you include the people who were actually present at the time, instead of just speaking of a dark ages where everything disappears. My final example, which I've already hinted at, is going to be Nordic myth. The myths, the Viking myths, the Viking stories. So you've probably heard of the Vikings. You might associate them with a trip to North America, which did happen, or the Icelandic sagas, which of course are amazing, or Greenland. But the truth of the matter, as our Ukrainian friends will know, is that the main line of Viking exploration was actually to the south and the east, into what is now the Baltics, what is now Finland, what is now northern Russia, what is now Belarus, what is now Ukraine. There was an extraordinary Viking globalization in which they reached all the continents except Latin America, Antarctica, and Australia, in which they dominated the technology of shipping, and in which they had a long encounter, almost 400 years, with Arab speakers. The reason why the Vikings did what they did was Arab silver, first of all. Arab speakers, Khazars, some of whom converted to Judaism probably, Bulgars in what's now Russia, who had converted to Islam, and finally Kiev. Now, why am I stressing all of this? Why am I mentioning all this? Because we have a notion, again, this is sort of a European, I'm afraid, or North European we, but many of us have a notion, or people from beyond also have a notion that the Vikings were these like fair-haired conquerors from the north and everything about them is pure and northern and so on. And that's just not even remotely true. The Viking stories that we like are all a consequence of their long encounter with Eastern Europe and with Asia, an encounter which ends with them founding a city in Kiev, which is known as Rus. If you like, so I'll just give you a few examples, but Odin being one-eyed, or Odin having a special access to wisdom, that comes from Finnish and Baltic stories. Valhalla, the idea that you and your special group of selected warriors are going to go to a place after death and fight again, that is a Turkic notion. Ragnarok, and this is something I'm going to have a lot of fun writing about when I finally write this book, is an essentially Jewish idea, which is preserved in apocryphal texts in Kiev, because when the Ukrainians converted to Christianity, as I said before, it's actually hilarious how little sorting out of the texts was done. So the first monks and Christians in Kiev were reading Jewish texts from Egypt from the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, because nobody really knew what else they should be reading. And I don't have time for it, but the stuff in there is wild. And it includes notions of a final confrontation between light and darkness. It includes the notions of dark fire, which is so important for Wagner in the Ring Cycle, but also for Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. So what the Vikings did was they managed to experience multiple cultures and bring them all together into their fascinating, I think it's the most fascinating, pagan religion before they converted. And when they did convert, okay, so the story of how Rus converted, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about because I don't want to get that close to the present before I conclude. The story of how Rus converted. So these Vikings, they didn't found Kiev probably, it was the Khazars probably who did, but the Vikings control Kiev and they get their Christianity from Byzantium. How do they get it? The way that they get it is one of their warlords, Valdemar/Volodymyr, goes to Chersonesus, which is a Greek city, and storms it and runs off with what he claims and they claim to be the relics of Saint Clement. That's how it happens. So, who was Saint Clement? Saint Clement was an early Roman churchman of whom we have one letter. He was later promoted to pope because, and I say this with like love to all the Jesuits out here who know it's true, he became a pope because later they had to make a list of popes. No, that's how it actually works, people. Like if you need a list, you always need a genealogy, and so you have to go back and kind of fill in the gaps. So Clement was retroactively promoted to pope because they needed to have a pope. Not the only one, by the way. And then he became the subject, and some of you scholars of early Christianity might know this, of fascinating stories involving, for example, that he went to Chersonesus, on what's now Crimea, and he was martyred there. Okay, it didn't happen. He never went there. He wasn't martyred there. So his bones can't be there. But nevertheless, we then had, and I say this with respect for miracles. Miracles are very important in history, but I have to just say why this is interesting. So Clement's bones were then recovered by Cyril and Methodius, or Cyril, just Cyril, but Cyril of Cyril and Methodius fame. They were then recovered and brought back. Okay, none of that, of course, actually happened. Cyril and Methodius didn't actually also go there. But those non-existent relics of a person who never went to Kherson became the basis of the conversion of Rus. Now, I'm not saying this just to like dispel the whole myth. I love myths. Myths are very important in history. I'm saying it for an important reason. The story of going to Chersonesus and recovering, it was actually the skull, not to get too graphic about it, of Saint Clement, is that legend was modeled practically paragraph for paragraph on the older Greek play Iphigenia and Taurus. The adventure story of going to Chersonesus and finding a religious relic, it's the same story in both cases, which is an example of how the oldest, the story that we take, I'm making just a very simple point, the story that we take to be primary when it comes to the history of Rus is itself modeled on a much older story, which is just one way of saying that all of the things that have to do with the history of Rus, all of them go back to much older histories, and that's where I want to close. So, of course, bits of this ancient history are known to various people and have been put to various uses at various times. When the Nazis wanted to invade Ukraine, they invoked the history of the Goths. When Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, he invoked his own version of the history of Rus. In both cases, the invaders blocked out all of the other context and all of the other interesting things that happened before and after. But here's what I find interesting. When we put these stories and these histories together, I hope, and you can tell me if I didn't do it right, but I hope it's the case that the history of the world makes more sense. It's also the case that big parts of our contemporary culture start to fall into place. So I'm not going to look right at you when I say this, but probably some of you are familiar with the heroes of DC Comics and of Marvel Comics, right? Wonder Woman does not exist without really existing female warriors in Scythia, just as Thor and Odin and the whole batch over at Marvel do not exist without the cultural encounter of Vikings and Asians in and around Rus. Things that we take for granted as American mass culture simply could not exist without the actual history of the lands of Ukraine. But I want to push this one step further. When we talk about the Ukrainian national movement, okay, people, there's this obsession with how Ukraine is new and so on. I talked to a gentleman after a lecture the other day, and he said, "Well, Ukraine is only 35 years old or whatever, or 25." And I said, "Well, Russia is too. That's a." But there's this we've all been kind of trained, we just heard of Ukraine, therefore it must be new, something like that. And as Professor Stent said, and it's very true, most of us were educated in some kind, if we were educated in this stuff at all, we were educated in some kind of Russian imperial framework. And so then at some deep level, we're uncomfortable with being told that there was something else. And then we were told that, well, insofar as Ukraine exists, it's like an artificial creation of Ukrainian nationalists, and they must have some dumb story. And that's where I want to land. The people who actually generated the Ukrainian national story were totally uninterested in there being some kind of Ukrainian ethnos that has existed forever. None of them actually said anything like that. That is our dumb imposition on history. If you take Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the first historian of Ukraine, or the first major one, or Ivan Franko, the most important writer, or Lesi Ukrainka, probably the most beautiful of the Ukrainian writers, figures from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, arguably three, or certainly three of the most important creators of Ukrainian national ideas, all of them talked more like I just talked than they talked like ethnic nationalists. Hrushevsky obsesses in volume 1 of his long history with the question of the origins of Indo-European. Ivan Franko spent the second half of his adult life collecting apocryphal documents about the colorful history of Ukrainian Christianity. And Lesi Ukrainka, who's an extremely interesting writer who died very young, spent her writing career talking about the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Iliad, the Scythians, as elements of how might one understand a modern Ukraine. In other words, they didn't know all the things we know. They didn't have the ancient DNA, but they were able to do something which is very interesting, which is to imagine Ukraine not as some kind of boring continuity of something which was always the same, but rather to imagine Ukraine as involving bits and pieces of a whole lot of things which touched on world history, which actually turns out to be the case. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. So on behalf of the American Academy, I'm
beautiful.
pleased to hand you the Patrick Moynihan Prize.
Thank you, Sean.
And now Alexa Chopivsky of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. Once she gets her mic, we'll... Welcome.
Thank you. Wow, Tim, your lecture was a tour de force, extraordinary scholarship, and historical perspicacity. Congratulations on winning the 2025 Moynihan Award.
Thank
Well
you.
deserved.
Thank you.
There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to discuss. Our time is finite, so let's jump right in. U.S. Ambassador to Russia under both Trump 1 and Biden, John Sullivan, writes in his memoir. He says, Russian leadership would shamelessly advance any position or argument, no matter how counterfactual or ahistorical, that was useful to support Putin, the state, at any given time. In the summer of 2021, less than a year before the full-scale invasion, Putin penned an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He in turn used this essay as a defense of his invasion. Tim, you are a prize-winning, globally renowned historian. Let's unpack Putin's essay. And are there connections there in that essay to what he repeatedly refers to today in terms of wanting to get rid of the, quote, root causes of the war? Mm-hmm. What does he mean by root causes?
Thank you. I think that's a very perceptive question. So first of all, Ambassador Stefanishyna kindly said that I respond to Putin. I really try hard not to, because, no, I mean, I'm going to answer the question, but I just want to make a point which is very important. There's a reason why I spent my time talking about what I think is interesting about the history of the lands of Ukraine, and that is that these terrible, politically motivated or psychologically obsessed arguments, they frame things in a way which is just not interesting, which is in a way just not, it's not lively, right? It's not true either, and it's dangerous. But the problem is that, like, in responding to them directly, we end up getting caught in some way in them. And so I think it's very important the most important thing that historians can do is to do history and be articulate about it and draw people into interesting interpretations. I'm not like, I'm going to do it, but I'm not here to be Putin's fact checker. Because the things which are wrong with his interpretation are mostly metaphysical. So number one, even if we assume that he was right about what happened 1,100 years ago, nothing that happened 1,100 years ago makes people unfree today, right? I mean, there's just, the nature of the claim is absurd. I can't say that because South Asia was ruled by somebody 1,100 years ago, the South Asians have to have a certain kind of regime now. I can't say, that because Mexico was ruled by somebody 1,100 years ago, they have to have a certain kind of regime now. That's absurd. And the fact that we even vaguely accept that kind of reasoning with respect to Russia and Ukraine suggests that we think of them as some kind of, barbarians or something where these other rules apply. Because if someone suggested to Americans that, oh, let's find out who ruled you 1,100 years ago, and let's go back to that situation, right? I think we would have methodological objections as well as other objections, right? So it's a crazy kind of claim. But another thing which is wrong with it is the tyranny of interpretation. So the notion is that one man today says what happened then. And the implication is because he says what happened then, he also gets to say what happens tomorrow. So that also kind of goes overlooked. But that's not what history is. I mean, history isn't one. I mean, I've been pinned to the wall at a lot of cocktail parties, so I can tell you this. History is not what one ignoramus tells you. It's an ongoing process of investigation, interpretation, and argument. And no matter how much power you have, the claim about the past then is ultimately a power claim rather than an interpretive claim. And so then the final thing I want to say about this, which is really important, is that when you make a claim that like something has to be today because of the way it was 1,000 years ago or whatever, what you are doing is you're saying all the things that happened in the meantime don't matter, right? So, for example, all the Ukrainians who did whatever interesting things Ukrainians did, that doesn't matter. It all doesn't matter. What you're saying is that history is just a matter of this point and this point, I'm drawing a line. And if the facts seem to be in the way of my line, or if there's some fact which isn't on my line, so much the worse for the facts. And I just want to say that that is inherently totalitarian, right? That this kind of argument is inherently totalitarian because what you're saying is that all of the human actions in the meantime didn't matter. There were no human choices. There was just eternal Russia, which is nonsense. Russia just came into being the day before yesterday. It's very new. But the idea of eternal Russia means no contingent people, no free people, no decisions mattered at any point. And so that model of talking about the past becomes the model of how we talk about the present and about the future. So the easy thing to say is that like in 862, like Rurik wasn't a Russian, and it like the story of Rurik founding a town, by the invitation of local Slavs, almost certainly didn't happen. It's a Scandinavian colonial story. They always have three brothers. You guys don't even know the story, right? Or do you? Okay, good for you if you don't. That's fine. What Putin is telling Trump is true is that there was a Scandinavian called Rurik who was invited in 862, and somehow that created Russia, which exists forever, okay? I mean, frankly, you could think of a better story, I would have thought, because like it didn't happen, and he's a Scandinavian, he wasn't, and there wasn't Russia at the time. But that's the easy part. There was, of course, no Russia at the time. Anyway, let's leave it at that.
Let's talk about Russian academic imperialism here in the West. For years, we have drank the Kremlin Kool-Aid in terms of teaching and learning a Russian-centric version of history and culture of the region. You alluded to it in your talk, Professor Stent alluded to it. Even in the fall of 2022, a full 7 months after the full-scale invasion, according to Yale, you taught the only class in the US that was a full survey lecture course on the history of Ukraine. Harvard, for example, taught a history of Ukraine, but it started in 1500, which I find startling given that the Ukraine war has been called the most significant geopolitical and global security shift since the end of the Cold War. So let's take a step back. Can you please describe Russian academic imperialism for us? What does that look like? What instigated that phenomenon in the West? And to what effect today? How has it impacted US and Western policy making with respect to Russia, both pre and post invasion?
Okay, several points there, and I'll try to be brief. The first is that there's something I felt very strongly in this country in 2022, especially right around the days of the invasion, which speaks to this very directly. Of course, we're in DC, and this is a land of careful analysis, but there are certain unspoken priors, and I think Professor Stent referred to this indirectly in her introduction. There are certain unspoken priors about how we think the world really is, which come into play before we start doing the analysis, like the quiet axioms of the way the world really works. And one of those axioms in Washington, D.C. in February 2022 was Russia is a real country and Ukraine is not a real country. That this is a real place and this is not a real place. And where that comes from is precisely education. So we may not, some of us in this room have had spectacularly impressive educations in Russian history, not everybody, but in general, if you had like one class in college, which is like what we hope for, if you had one class in college, it would have been along the lines of a certain, let's say, teleology, which is very similar actually to what Mr. Putin says, that there was this guy called Rurik in 862, and then somehow it only gets funnier. Like Rurik had a friend called Oleg, and then Rurik died very late. He was old, but he had a baby, we don't know by who, and Oleg took the baby and put it under his coat, and then he and some friends went to Kiev, and he snuck the baby into Kiev, and then he was like, look, there's a baby, and it's your king. And everybody in Kiev said, yay, he's our king. That's the primary chronicle. Now you don't have to read it. And then Kiev becomes the first city, and it's not called Russia, but 500 years later, some people in Moscow, after a lot of time with the Mongols, get the idea that they need to have a genealogy, so they make up this thing. Remember what I said about Clement and the popes and so on. Everybody does that, right? So they went back and they made up this idea of a Rurikid dynasty, which goes back all the way, to this guy Rurik, who was a Dane. So that story though, which was the Russian imperial historians of the 19th century took that story and they did wonderful things with it, like as historians in times of empire will do. They took limited materials and they came up with a wonderfully persuasive history, which the premises of which didn't come under question, except, by the way, by Ukrainian historians such as Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who basically founded social history to combat this narrative. What Hrushevsky said was, history is about the people, let's try to follow history of the people, which is quite a radical move in the second half of the 19th century. But that narrative, that imperial narrative, comes to the United States in the early 20th century. It comes after the Bolshevik Revolution, and it's the basis of our textbooks. And not just ours, the French, the German, the British, the Dutch, the Italians, we all have this narrative. And in that narrative, there is no room for Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't exist. None of the things I talked about, of course, happened, but in general, there's Russia, Russia, Russia. And there are many problems with this, right? Not that I don't think you should study Russian history. I mean, everyone should study Russian history, but it's that when you think of it as, the Soviet Union then becomes Russia, and the Russian Empire is Russia, right? And in fact, neither of those things was Russia. The Russian Empire was this huge multinational thing, and so was the Soviet Union, and the role of Russia in both of them is very ambiguous. And the Russian nation in both of them doesn't arrive until quite late in the game, at least in my view. But in an imperial narrative, as we all know from American history, certain things get pushed to the side and are marginalized and are never seen, and Ukraine was the most important of these. So there is this problem of the Russian pattern, and we do have to get out of it. And I should say, in fairness, that I have wonderful colleagues in Russian history, many of whom are in this room, who've been doing a lot of good work in this direction, and that's important. But before we blame the Russians for everything, it's very important to note that the main problem in the US right now is the attack on the humanities in general. So it's going to be pretty hard to get Ukrainian history back without getting history back, and it's going to be hard to get history back without getting the humanities back. And I'm going to just point out that the attack on the humanities, like this sort of, like, what I'm trying to do is go on the offensive for the humanities. Like, I'm trying to show what we can do and how it's interesting and how it's necessary even for politics. But in general, if we want to have a free society and a society which has a rule of law and which we understand where people are coming from, we as a nation in general are going to have to do much better with the humanities. And I hope as the humanities come back, then we can have more sensible teaching also about Ukraine.
As a side note, Tim, we have a full house today. We have a lot of academics in the room. You can find Russian and East European Studies majors at universities across this country. I was a Russian and East European Studies major. We were trained on Ryazanovsky, that he wrote the Bible of the discipline. Yeah. It was influential, it was widely read. It also downplayed Ukrainian history, and it made it part of a large Russian narrative, leading many students to absorb the idea that Ukraine was just a part of one endless Russia, as opposed to distinct from it, a distinct people on their own land, no matter who they happened to be under, rule at that time, whether it was Poland, Lithuania, Turkey, Moscow. I was a recipient of that education, but through personal channels, I had access to, for example, Subtelny's History of Ukraine, which, believe me, we were not reading as part of the curriculum in official curriculum at the university in 2001. Russian and East European Studies, that name alone has an imperialist undertone embedded in it. We in this country have Latin American studies, we have African studies. We don't have, name the country, Brazilian and South American studies majors. We don't have Nigerian and African studies majors. Asia studies majors that include a reference to China in their title are incredibly rare, but for maybe one example at Cornell. And yet, Russian and East European studies majors are a dime a dozen in this country. The name alone grants Russia a status of exceptionalism, which in turn invites a preordained bias or significance. Is that appropriate? How do you see that? And is this tradition on the cusp of change, especially in light of recent world events?
All right. So, I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to try to stay on a slightly different level before I do, because I'm going to repeat something I said earlier, or restate it. It doesn't, like, whether or not Ukraine exists doesn't depend on what either Americans teach or what Russians say. And that's really important because, underneath all of this is the temptation to say that the Russian story is right, because if it's not right, we have to do something. That's what lies underneath all of that. Okay, so it's important to me that whatever the Russians have done to our brains, it's important to remember that they are our brains, and that it's up to us to see how this has worked and to do something about it. And the danger of this kind of discussion, in my view, is that it takes us, like, happy as I am to talk about American academic departments and historiography, it takes us away from the very basic proposition, which is that a nation exists because of what its people do, right? So the notion that Ukraine doesn't exist is absurd for different reasons, which is that if anybody exists as a nation in the world right now, It's the Ukrainians. If anybody does, the prima facie evidence for their existence is so much stronger than for the existence of Americans. I mean, we might not like that, but the ability of the Americans to defend themselves against some kind of existential threat to their sovereignty is, let us say, not fully demonstrated. Whereas the ability of the Ukrainians to do so has been fully demonstrated. And that is what nationhood is actually about. It's about your existence in a moment of history. It's about your collective ability to have some notion of what the future is going to be and do something about it. I mean, I love history, I'm a historian, but it's not fundamentally about what the story of the past is. Now, of course, this stuff is very important because it helps us, we need to be able to understand what the world is like. And I take the point, I'm just going to add the other historical thing about us. One of the reasons, Alexa, why these things are called the way they are is because of the Cold War. And the Cold War, with all the appropriate qualifications, the Cold War is one of the few things which pushed Americans to have studies of the rest of the world at all. And when we start, and it's hard to overstate the degree of ignorance of Americans, including in federal departments in 1944, 45, 46, 47, when we were forced to engage in a consistent way because of the Second War and the Cold War. And when we founded and you've studied this, I'm sure, more carefully than me, but when we founded the State Department and other programs which were meant to foster language and other research, those were all based on the notion that the Soviet Union was basically Russia, and the way to get into Russia was by studying Russian literature. And that's where that all comes from, right? We are still in the legacy of that. And insofar as we have East European studies at all, it's because of that still. What actual departments are fighting to preserve in the present environment is that very flawed legacy. That's where we are. So I agree with you. In Yale, we renamed it to something or other, and in Toronto, it's been renamed. I agree. That's not how it should be called. But I would emphasize that not only in naming, but just in general, there has to be a rebirth of area studies and the humanities in general. And as we do that, then we can try to get the names right the second time around.
You said a nation exists on the basis of what its people do. I would argue that Russia has been very effective in exporting its proclaimed culture and its prominence. And I would argue that Ukraine has undercommunicated what it contributes to our prosperity here in the West on a daily basis, even despite the war. Very quickly, Ukraine is a world leader in ag tech and food security. Before the war, US and Ukraine together controlled 68% of the world's grain export market, with the potential for more. Ukraine feeds 400 million people globally annually. Manufacturing, Jaguar, Audi, BMW. Ukraine manufactures its auto parts, its infotainment systems. I'm sure we have skiers here in the audience. Over 50% of the world's skis are manufactured in Ukraine. Oreo cookies manufactured in Ukraine are exported to over 47 countries. Tech and innovation prowess. PayPal and WhatsApp, their co-founders, born and raised in Ukraine. The gas lamp and the helicopter, invented in Ukraine. Amongst the world's most valuable startups, unicorns, 1 billion plus valuated startups, Grammarly, GitLab, McCourt, PandaDoc, they have Ukrainian founders. We talked about ag tech. Ukraine now is a leader in defense tech with real world frontline experience we should all be learning from. And finally, IT outsourcing and solutions. 100 plus global companies before the war chose to put their R&D in Ukraine, Ring, Google, Siemens, Samsung, Oracle, in order to collaborate with the #1 software and engineering force in Central and Eastern Europe. So I would argue that, a nation exists on the basis of what its people do. Its strength, its significance, its value to the West is under-communicated. Do you agree with that?
I mean, that's a funny sort of question. Long statement and then yes or no, and I'm not going to say yes or no. So first of all, you've raised grave moral questions for me as a father about Oreos, because Oreos were something I wasn't allowing my kids to eat. Now I've got to go back and reevaluate that. You didn't mention stalker, which is a pure, okay, ooh, I'm seeing what kind of demographic we have here. You didn't mention Stalker, which is one of the best video games in the world, which is purely 100% Ukrainian. Like, not just like, yeah, there we go. There we go. All right. So here's what I think about that. First of all, agriculture, just by the way, just note that this point about agriculture is a through line all the way back to where I started the whole lecture. These nice people building the first cities were relying on the ability to make to make central Ukraine fertile. And one round of interpretation actually says that those settlements led to the partly human generated thing that we see as nature, which is the steppe. But however that may be, the fertility of the Ukrainian lands is a relationship to Greece in the ancient world. And it's a relationship all the way through, like for the last 2,500 years, it's a through line of Ukrainian history. As is innovation in various ways. But as for like how selling yourself or how you present yourself, I've got, a slightly different maybe view of this, which is that like asking whose job that is. Because to your list of things, I could add other things besides stalker. The most important thing I would add is the existence of democracy such as it is in Europe and North America. If the Ukrainians didn't fight in 2022, we would be in a completely different world. And that point is vastly, so to speak, undersold. We vastly underestimate in our provincialism and self-absorption how much our institutions depend upon the fact that Ukrainians were courageous enough to defend a version of them, basically. That is vastly undersold. To the extent to which the Ukrainians are fighting the war themselves is vastly undersold. If you read the American press, like everything depends upon some backroom discussion of like whether we were going to give them Patriot, ammunition or not. The American discussion about the Ukrainian war, with many honorable exceptions, has been hilariously about Americans talking to other Americans and then leaking what Americans said to other Americans to American reporters. It's vastly undersold. The extent to which Ukrainians have armed themselves, have innovated themselves into the defensive posture that they're in. Now, all of that is vastly undersold, in addition to what you're talking about. So the question that I would raise is, whose job is that actually, right? Like, is it the Ukrainians' job? Because they're busy. No doubt we could be more receptive, but I think there's a question as to who exactly should be doing the thing that you're talking about? Because your point is a valid one. You exist because of things you do, but you also exist because other people understand what you're doing. I guess I would just say, like, as a point to the North American diaspora and to Friends of Ukraine in general, I don't actually think this is the Ukrainians' job. I have ideas about how they could do it better too, but I don't actually think it's their job. I think it's somebody else's job.
Let's talk about the linguistic situation in Ukraine and how that's playing into narratives and geopolitical power plays. As part of the defense of his invasion, Putin said he had to protect the Russian speakers in Ukraine. Even a senior official from a Western country, I won't name names, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, reportedly told President Zelensky that he should give Donbass to Russia because there are a lot of Russian speakers there. There happen to be very large, sometimes predominant, groups of Russian speakers elsewhere in Ukraine. This is the product of centuries of forced Russification under the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. Some of the most patriotic Ukrainians I know are native Russian speakers. The journalist who started the Revolution of Dignity when Ukraine rose up towards the EU and against Russia, he is a native Russian speaker. President Zelensky himself, although his Ukrainian is excellent, is a native Russian speaker. He grew up speaking Russian at home. And Tim, you know this, when you walk down the street in Kiev as recently as 2021, they have news kiosks on the streets. And for our purposes, let's choose the one that's closest to Verkhovna Rada, to the Parliament of Ukraine. You go there, and 90% of the magazines and newspapers on the shelves of that news kiosk are in the Russian language, 10% in Ukrainian. That's my anecdotal observation. It's also backed by research. They did a study on this in 2021. Does this picture I just recounted to you describe an assault on the Russian language? And how do you explain all these Russian speakers throughout the country who are giving their lives not to be a part of Russia? In other words, can you help us better understand the history of imperialism that created this linguistic dynamic and plurality of languages in Ukraine?
Well, again, I think it's important to start from the fundamental question of why we accept or would accept the logic in the first place. So before we get to the example of Russians and Ukrainians, I think it's important to inquire why we would think in any case at all that language would play this sort of role. So what language did the American revolutionaries speak? English. It's a fair amount of German too, incidentally, but yeah, English, right? And their difference with the British Empire was a political one. It was not a matter of like, oh, we're ethnic Americans and now we're going to fight the ethnic English. And we have a different ethnic American language. So it's interesting that we would accept at all the framing. And again, I think the only reason we do accept the framing is because we think this is some kind of barbaric, this is some sort of barbaric other land where other rules apply. It used to be one could use the example of Canada for this. It used to be you could say, well, the Canadians speak the same language that but we wouldn't dream of, you can't use that example anymore. But you get the general point. Like France doesn't invade Belgium because the Belgians speak French, right? The Switzerland doesn't invade Germany because the Germans speak German. That's not how it works or has ever worked. The history of warfare is not actually the history of people who speak different languages fighting people who speak different languages. In the fall of the Roman Empire, which I had the pleasure of alluding to very briefly, you had confederations of German speakers and other speakers, Romance speakers on both sides, right? That's not how war works. It's never been that way. And it's not how international law works. International law defines borders on the basis of law. You can't just say, because there are 5 Spanish speakers you can't just say like time for, whatever, San Diego to head over to Mexico because there are Spanish speakers there. That's not how international law works. And so I'll answer the question, but like what I think is very important for all of us is to recognize that even if, insofar as we entertain these ethnic arguments coming from Russia, we're making some kind of weird exception to how we talk about the world in general, because that's not how we talk about the world in general. And why are we making this exception, I think is the real question. And I think we make this exception because of a prior commitment to the idea that Ukraine is not a real place, and therefore we can just use whatever argument, even though the arguments are ridiculously bad. Right? We should feel insulted that Russians are telling us, or anybody is telling us, that Ukraine should be part of Russia because people speak Russian there. That makes no sense whatsoever. If language rules were true like that, Russia would immediately have to break up into 100 different countries because 100 languages are spoken in Russia, right? But somehow nobody makes that point, or like all the Ukrainians in Siberia should get their Ukrainian Autonomous Republic. But they don't for some reason, and that is because these are in fact not the rules. As far as language and politics, so that's my main point. But as far as language and politics, I think it's important to understand that it's the politics that goes first, and then the language comes after. So a lot more Ukrainian is being spoken now. I say this as somebody who's been going to Kyiv for 30 years plus now, and it has changed. But it's changed much the way that language use in Prague changed in the late 19th century. It was not that people in Prague suddenly switched from being ethnic Germans to ethnic Czechs overnight. It was that the politics changed at a certain point so that you reached a kind of tipping zone where the same people began to speak a different language because of historical forces and because of their own decisions. And that's what human life is actually like. So it's true, many prominent Ukrainians speak Russian, whatever that means. I don't even like the notion Russian speaker, because it's like, if you're a Russian speaker, because I see people in this crowd who are Russian speakers, right? So I find it weird to say because there's a Russian speaker in this crowd, we should entertain the notion that Russia should invade. So even Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, I don't even like those categories, because everybody in Ukraine who speaks one to some extent speaks the other. I mean, even the Galician Ukrainians in the West who's Russian, who can't spell it anymore, like they still have some Russian. And even the most Russophone Ukrainians from the East, they have some kind of passive Ukrainian. And so like their linguistic situation is special to their country. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And how they sort it out is going to be for them to figure out. At the moment, like the trend is towards more Ukrainian and less Russian. But I would say that's because of people responding to historical circumstances in a way which is entirely understandable, rather than because like some people really are this and some people really are that in an ethnic way.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have Q&A with the audience.
Oh, okay.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, famously said, "It cannot be stressed enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine subordinated and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." Mm-hmm. Given that some policymakers can have short-term selective memories, when peace is finally reached, Tim, how concerned are you for a regression with respect to U.S. and Western policy towards Russia? Mm-hmm. What are the lessons, what are the guideposts that policymakers should keep top of mind in ensuring an appropriate, effective, sustained policy posture towards Russia as they go about doing their business of doing good?
Okay, I'll do my best. But I first want to say a word about Zbigniew Brzezinski. I miss Zbigniew Brzezinski whenever he had time for me. He said all manner of reasonable things. And he was one in an important school of, I will call it, Polish political thought, which recognized the point that you made, namely that Ukraine is especially significant for the nature of Russia. I will just, for all you Poles out there, the point also applied to Poland. The notion was that if we respect Ukraine, then we won't become an empire, or we won't try to become an empire, and that will be good for us. So Brzezinski was coming out of a school of political thought, which was developed mainly among post-war Polish emigres around a journal called Kultura in Maison Lafitte in France, which made this remarkable contribution. A history-altering contribution, because not only Zbigniew Brzezinski, but a number of important Poles in Poland came to this conclusion before 1989, which had everything to do with how things shook out after 1991. Because after 1991, Ukraine only had one imperial problem, which seems like a lot, but it's less than 2 or 3, which is the traditional position that Ukraine. So by 91, the only possible imperial problem was Russia, whereas historically it was also Poland and some version of Germany. So this level of maturity about Ukraine, that Ukraine matters for our own development or for the development of other countries, is where I'm going to. Oh, I want to say one more thing about Dr. Brzezinski. The last time I talked to him, we were at a reception at Harvard, and he pulled me aside and he said, "You know, Snyder, like your historical work is very important, but my favorite book of yours is The Red Prince." And so for those of you who might not know, The Red Prince is a story of a cross-dressing Habsburg Archduke who wanted to be king of Ukraine. And I'm very proud of it, but I was very happy to know that Zbigniew Brzezinski thought that was my best book. Your best book, Snyder, it's Red Prince. But so, I mean, the premises to the answer, I think, are contained very well in the question. U.S. policy under every guise since 1991 has been ineffective in achieving core announced goals with respect to Russia. The times that we have been most successful with respect to Russia have been when we have had an active policy towards Ukraine. And the logic of Brzezinski's position, I think, remains absolutely sound. It is hard for us to directly affect Russia. The Russians like to tell us that we can, if you only do this nice thing, we won't nuke you. You know, they like to suggest that there's a lot of simple quid pro quos, and there aren't, right? We've had 3 decades almost to figure this out. What we have learned is that you can have an effect on Russia by supporting Ukraine. And so my basic answer to your question is that when this war, may it happen, when this war comes to an end, The significant thing, the most significant thing you can do to help Russia is to help rebuild Ukraine. That is the best thing you can do for the Russians. The best thing to do for the Russians is to make sure, first of all, that Ukraine wins, and then to make sure that Ukraine is rebuilt. That is the best thing one can do for Russia, because Russian imperialism is not, in fact, good for the Russians themselves. It promotes the present status quo of oligarchy and political repression. So that's my basic answer, is that as during the war, so after the war, the main way the U.S. can exert positive pressure in the direction of Russia is to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Snyder.
Terrific note to end on.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.